speaker is speaking. I'm Andy Miller. I'm a professor in the Department of Geography and Environmental Systems. I'm officially in charge of running this seminar series. And Hugh O'Connor, one of our graduate students, is actually going to introduce our speaker today. Before he does that, I'll just ask people, when it comes time, if you have questions that you would like to ask, we would request you post them in the chat, and then we will go through them in order, and we will invite you to unmute yourself and actually ask your question. And you can, turn your video camera when you do that if you want. But that if we have the questions in the chat, that we know what sequence they came in, and we can keep track of how many there are. And we'll ask people to remain muted until we ask them to unmute in order to ask a question. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Hugh and ask Hugh to go ahead and introduce our speaker.
All right, hello everyone. I'm very happy to introduce our speaker today, who is Dr. Timothy Thomas. Dr. Thomas is the research director for UC Berkeley's Urban Displacement Project, where he specializes in urban sociology, demography, and data science. His research focuses on how neighborhood change, housing, and displacement affects household socioeconomic stratification by race and gender in the United States. Dr. Thomas is also the principal investigator for the Eviction Study, a multi-metropolitan analysis of the neighborhood drivers of eviction using data science and statistical tools to enumerate previously unobserved populations. Over the past several years, his team's work on evictions has provided empirical evidence that helped pass several tenant protection laws in Washington State and Maryland. In addition to his work on evictions, Dr. Thomas has published academic articles and reports on migration, gentrification, homelessness, hate crimes, and displacement.
Thanks, Hugh, and thank you, Andy, so much. I'm going to assume everyone can hear me. If not, just give me a thumbs down. But it's a real pleasure to be here, especially given the fact that we've done some work in Baltimore, and we're very passionate about what's going on in Maryland, in the state, and hopefully that this work can kind of inspire some folks and to continue working on this context of evictions in this area. I'm going to talk real briefly, mostly overall, about the general project that we run, the Eviction Study. And I'm just going to start with that. And then I'll talk a little bit more about some of the regional effects that are going on, particularly in Baltimore, Chicago, even the Bay Area. We've been expanding our research to other cities. And then briefly talk a little bit about pandemic dynamics that are occurring at this moment. So before I get started, largely what I'm going to talk about is evictions. One of the biggest problems about evictions is that we have very limited data on understanding what's going on. Most of you probably have heard about the Eviction Lab. Matthew Desmond wrote the book Evicted in 2012, which really raised the issue of evictions to the public and scholarly view. But for, one of the things that was really problematic about it is there's very limited data. He was able to get a very large grant and purchase a lot of data from LexisNexis, but even then there were a lot of gaps and a lot of holes. What the Eviction Study does is we try to fill those gaps and holes by actually using data science techniques such as natural language processing, Bayesian statistics, and other things like that, to try and understand who's getting evicted, where people are getting evicted, and neighborhood dynamics. But before we get started, let's kind of situate ourselves around this idea of where an eviction falls in the line of mobility and population dynamics. If you think about this mobility curve, if we think about households that move at will versus moved by force, you can see at the bottom here you have economic status on the x-axis, where low income is to the left and high income is to the right. And then you have the level of residential mobility on the left-hand side. And as you can see, folks that are higher income tend to move where they will, where they want. They tend to move towards areas that are more advantageous, better networks, maybe for jobs. Middle income households tend to not move so much. They try to maintain a lot of stability if they can. And then lower income households tend to fall within this line of forced mobility where they're victim to the market and other areas. We know a lot about these latter 2/3, but we know very little about this first third, about forced mobility. And in fact, I'm going to give away a little bit of the talk here. Some of the research that we've been finding at the Urban Displacement Project is that while eviction and displacement are kind of within this dynamic of forced mobility, they're not necessarily overlapping. In fact, we find evidence that there's some negative relationships between eviction and displacement. In other words, what this means is that if you consider displacement, which is low-income households moved by force, either because of rising rents, they're moving on their own, but they may not be wanting to move, thus the term displaced. This tends to happen in spaces that are different than where evictions happen. Evictions tend to happen in the lowest income neighborhoods, and I'll show some evidence behind that and explain this kind of phenomenon a little bit more. But if we continue with this understanding of eviction, Matt Desmond wrote in 2012, he says evictions falls at this intersection of housing burden, in other words, people paying more than 30% of their income to rent, increasing rents, and inadequate welfare systems. This leads to this dynamic of households not being able to pay rent even at minimum wage. So this graph shows from a study in 2012 in Milwaukee, showing that the welfare rate had not changed from 1997 to 2008, and the minimum wage slightly increased around 2004 to 2008. But as you can see, 1-bedroom and 2-bedroom homes are increasing at a rapid rate, even in low-income households. So this is kind of one of the cruxes of the issue of eviction. Individually, it happens to women more than other groups. Black evictions are very high. Families with children, especially single mothers with children, have a really high probability of being evicted. It happens in the poorest and most BIPOC neighborhoods. Latinx households tend to get evicted more in white neighborhoods. And folks are paying more than like 80 to 90% income towards rent. And this leads to worse health, layoffs, environmental hazard exposure, involuntary displacement, even homelessness and crime exposure. And I can talk more about any of those issues in a bit. And like I said before, what we do at the Eviction Study is we try to look at this overarching issue here of how the markets and residential segregation and neighborhood change play a role within the dynamics of eviction. So let's first talk about what does it take to get evicted? How long does it take to get evicted? This is a very good actual news article from the Review Journal in Las Vegas. They're one of the only groups that I know that's actually collected information on the actual time it takes from notice to physical removal. And as you can see, there's a lot of variation. I just kind of selected a few states within this area. And as you can see, Louisiana, Wyoming through Georgia have some of the quickest evictions, from 5 days to 9 days. And there are 3 points of information that are important within an eviction. There's the notice, and the notice period, basically what that does is, landlord goes to your door, posts a notice saying you have to pay or vacate. 90% of evictions are due to people not being able to pay their rent. And after that notice period, they may leave. We don't know how many people actually get notices. A lot of that information is not collected. And then they may leave right after the notice period itself. So if they stick around, it enters into the court period. The court period is basically what most states call unlawful detainers. You're unlawfully detaining the premises, so therefore the landlord could act a little bit more on things. And then you have the post-judgment, which is the point in which hold on one second. The eviction kind of happens by order of the court, and then the level at which that happens depends on how the state or the landlord and the parties can come to a resolution. And then finally, there's the writ of restitution after that, which leads to the fact that at any point within this period, people can leave by will up until the final point of the writ of restitution. The writ of restitution is the point where the sheriff actually goes in and collects the notice from the court and determines that it's time to remove folks and put their furniture on their lawn. As you can see, California has about a 22-day period between the notice period to the writ of restitution. Again, at any point, people can leave in that area. In Maryland, it's up to 25 days. What's interesting is Baltimore City has one of the biggest, the highest number of notices I've ever seen, which is around 140,000 notices per year. That leads to about 60,000 or so unlawful detainers. And then by the end of the day, about 7,000 to 9,000 people actually get physically removed by the sheriff. Now, people leave in that time period prior to that. So we're talking about tens to almost, tens of thousands of people being displaced through eviction. In Washington State, it's 29 days. Before 2019, it was only 18 days. And I'll talk a little bit about how some of this research helped change some of that. What I'm going to turn to now is focusing on the work that we did in Washington State, and then I'll talk a little bit about more other cities. Basically, in Washington State, we show that between 2004 and 2017, these are looking at unlawful detainer cases. There were 271,000 cases since 2004 to 17, which is about 17 to 22,000 per year. 1 in 55 Washington adults between 2013 and 17 were named in an eviction filing, and that's about 130,000 adults, or 1.8% of the population. And we saw that over 2004, over 400,000 people were named in an eviction process. The 397,697, that's a limited number. In other words, sometimes they would say Jane Smith and then other occupants are in there. What's interesting about this is that the data overall is very limited. This goes back to the issue of limitations in data and us trying to expand on who is being evicted. When you contact the courts trying to get a list of folks that have faced unlawful detainers, all you get is a case number, first name and last name, and that's not a lot of information. We do get some information on the judgment. In other words, whether or not people showed up to court or not. But this information is very limited. So what we had to do, forgive this number 8 there that got mixed in there a little bit. We actually went in and used these case records to use an HTML script to pull the actual physical court records, which were on PDFs or TIFF images. And then we use natural language processing to mine the text to get the address of the individuals. We converted or digitized this text. And this allowed us to extract the location where these evictions were happening. And with that, we can conduct demographic estimations on the locations. So we have the case numbers and we have the names, and now we have the addresses, and we can start to understand what's going on. We use the first name of the individual to estimate their sex or gender, whether they're male or female. This usually is about 80 to 90% accurate. And we then move on to what we call a Bayesian algorithm developed by Aime and Kana in 2016 to predict the race of the individuals within each of these cases. So if anyone's familiar with Bayesian statistics, basically what you can do is that it takes the shape of the data and it allows you to produce or provide a prior to help inform that data. For those of you that don't know Bayesian statistics, that's totally fine. Basically what this nasty algorithm is trying to say is that we want to find the probability of race, and we do that by gathering the location where people are at, taking the likelihood of being of a certain race in a certain tract. In other words, taking the racial composition of where they live. And then we have the prior of their name. So for example, the last name Jackson has a high probability of being African American. But if that Jackson is found in a white neighborhood, that reduces their probability of being African American and moves them to being more likely to be white. And then we compare that to the rest of the data that is in the data set itself. So with this Bayesian analysis, we're able to estimate the race of individuals. We actually compared this to actual intake data. We found that our estimates are within 2 to 5 percentage points of actual real data that is statistically significant and representative of the population of folks being evicted in certain areas. So we feel pretty confident with this, and this process has been used with voter registry records and is becoming a popular method in trying to estimate the race of individuals. So what do we find in Washington State? We see that this is basically an odds ratio of the gender of folks who faced eviction by county. Anything that's above this 1 means that more females were being evicted, or female-headed households were facing eviction. Anything below the 1 means more men were facing eviction during this time period. And as you can see, that a majority of the counties had over a 10% of the a 10% higher ratio of female to male ratio in there. King County and Snohomish actually had a few more men facing eviction. That's largely because of the demographic composition of that area. You have a lot more male-headed households in Snohomish, and you also have a lot more single men living in King County. But overall, we see that there is a huge gender gap, especially for more of the rural areas in Washington State. What's really interesting, though, is when we look at the race and gender combination, we start to see that women overall had 2% higher than men rate of eviction, but Black households, head of households, were facing evictions 4 times more than white households. Latinx were about 40% more than whites, but Black women were facing evictions 7 times more than white women, and Black men were facing evictions 5.4 times more than white men. So this bar graph in itself actually helped settle a case with the ACLU on disparate impact of evictions back in 2013. When we look at the types of neighborhoods in one of the counties, King County, which is the biggest or most populated county with Seattle located there, we see that on a spectrum, if you go from left to right, you're kind of looking at mostly all white to mostly diverse. You see that a lot of evictions kind of happen more in diversity. In fact, when we run a regression, we ran a negative binomial regression on this analysis, and one of the biggest, predictors is diversity in an area, as well as rent poverty and nearby poverty, which I can talk a little bit more about later. But in each of these spaces, Black households were facing the highest rate of eviction. What's troubling about this is in King County, only 9% of the Black population is represented in that area. When we look at the rent, we used Zillow data to look at the median rent at the tract level. We see that evictions are happening in the absolute smallest or lowest rent areas, lowest rent tracts in a neighborhood. This is concerning because evictions are happening basically in the cheapest areas. So there's obviously compounding issues where the market is driving rents. Rents are constantly going up, even in low-income areas. But in an area like King County that has such a high level of gentrification that's happening in that area, it's causing a lot of displacement of Black households in certain spaces. It's concerning that low income or the most affordable spaces are having the highest risk of forced removal through eviction. And finally, we did a study across multiple counties looking at race, in particular from 2013 to 2017. And what we found was that 18% of the Black population was named in an eviction filing in 5 years. So that's 1 in 6 Black adults were named in an eviction in Pierce County. Pierce County is just south of King County. It's part of the Puget Sound or Seattle metropolitan area. And a lot of people that are being displaced or moving out of King County or Seattle are moving into Tacoma, which is the major city in Pierce County. So there's a lot of interesting pressures that are moving as migration kind of moves south in that direction. In King County, which I've been talking about most, 1 in 11 Black adults, or 9.6% of the Black adult population, were facing an eviction. As you can see, all the other groups are much, much lower. Latinx households had the highest in Snohomish, which is just north of King County, which is about 4% or so of their Black population, or I'm sorry, of the Latinx population, excuse me. We also did some kind of temporal analysis of what's going on in King, and we saw that the relative risk of eviction, so this is basically determining how bad is eviction in an area as compared to the rest of the area. So in other words, the risk can be high, such as in these dark red areas. We see that it's kind of, this doesn't show this too well, but when we did a temporal analysis, we show that, or we found that eviction risk is moving south, which is an interesting phenomenon in itself. Tacoma is down south here, which I'll show in this next map. This is where Tacoma is in Pierce County, King, and Snohomish. A lot of the eviction risk is, as it moved down south into the Pierce County area, we're seeing the risk that's highest in these diverse neighborhoods. And up in Everett too, these are the areas where there's a lot of diversity. In King County, the risk is highest in the southern or racially diverse suburbs. And Snohomish and Pierce counties, it's happening most in the urban areas. Now, just to kind of step back, what's going on in this region is that Seattle right here has faced a lot of gentrification. And as you can tell, there's very low levels of eviction in this gentrifying space. This area just on the east side of Seattle, if you can see my cursor, is that's where most of the segregated Black population's been pushed to since 1920, since the Fair Housing Act. As we move to the southern portion, what's interesting is a lot of the Black households have been displaced down south since 1980. 1980 was about the last period of the high rate of segregation in the Seattle region. And the predicted probabilities show that, I apologize, my dog is coughing next to me here. The predicted probabilities of growth in Black neighborhood change show that the greatest predictors of eviction, or the greatest impact that's happening, is that areas that see increases in Black population and also Latinx populations see an increase or higher rates of eviction. And new movers and education has a negative relationship. What this means is that the Black population here, these are folks that have been moving to South King County, as well as the Latinx population. So in other words, areas that have seen an increase are seeing higher rates of eviction, whereas areas where a lot of displacement or segregation has occurred prior is where there was high rates of urban segregation. Black adults, there's a much lower rate of eviction in these spaces. However, areas that have new movers, in other words, places that are somewhat gentrifying, are showing that there's a higher rate of eviction where there are not new movers, in other words, places that are pretty stagnant, but areas down here that have high rates of new movers, in other words, destination spaces for people moving into gentrifying spaces, have very low rates of eviction. So why is there such a racial disparity? Well, as I kind of mentioned before, the Black population in 1920 and 1960 was forced into a small area in Seattle. And what that compounded with was the issue of redlining, which was basically bankers and brokers preventing loans or the ability to get credit in these certain spaces. These have led to the segregation of the Seattle area as it is today in 2010. So these redlined areas definitely show a lot of the racial diversity in the Seattle area. So what did this do? This created a massive wealth gap because through this time period in Seattle in particular, whites and Asians have been able to see a massive increase in their wealth, whereas Black and Latinx households have a very low rate of wealth, only $23,000. This also forced Black households to rent. 70% of the Black population rents in the Washington state area. 70% of Black households rent because of the inability to be able to purchase homes. There's a huge home ownership gap that, you know, we can talk a lot about. There's a wonderful book called The Color of Law, written by Rothberger. I forgot his last name, but it's an excellent book that discusses how the effects of housing policy drove and this gap intentionally separating and segregating Black and white households from being able to own homes. And then in Richard Rothstein, thank you, Morgan, Seattle Metro homeownership gap is even greater than the U.S. So you see that Hispanic and Black households are in the area of 28 to 36% of those folks own, whereas 65 to 61% of white households and Asian households own. So that's creating a bigger gap. And this map is kind of showing a little bit of the way that migration has been settling into these spaces. So as the Seattle area, anything in red basically shows a massive decrease over the past 40 years. Anything in blue shows a massive increase over the past 40 years. As you can see down south, this first graph shows the white population where they've been exiting out of most, upwards to 50 to 90% of these population within these tracts, or the composition of these tracts, have shifted away from being 80 to 90% white. A lot of them have been moving into the Seattle area. This is that 1920 to 1960 map that I showed that showed the concentration of Black households and segregation in these spaces. These are the gentrifying spaces in Seattle. We can see that there's been quite a bit of white flight basically in these lower South King County areas, even down in Pierce County. And Asian households have been able to grow in these spaces, as well as Latinx. But Black households have been kind of limited in terms of the space where they've been growing. There's been a huge Black exit in this small area in Seattle, which is where the segregation was occurring, and they've been pushed mostly down into the South King County area, which is also the area where the highest risk of eviction is happening as well. So if you're a renter, basically you are ultimately at risk of an eviction just because you are a renter. But there's compounding issues over time that have led to the disparity of Black households being named far more than any other group in eviction. Now, this urban core flight of Black households is not Seattle specific. It's happening in almost every metropolitan area with over 500,000 people. This kind of shows this happening in Chicago, DC, Boston, Atlanta, St. Louis, Las Vegas, San Francisco, all these other areas. And within San Francisco, which we've analyzed, and Atlanta and Chicago, you could almost connotate the blue increase as areas with the highest risk of eviction for Black households too. It's a very concerning pattern that we see. But to kind of further explain what's going on in this space is that in the King County area, or Washington State in general, we saw a massive increase in the rent. So from 2003 to 2013, average rent was pretty steady. If we look at this orange bar, this is the Washington State median rent. It was just below 800, got up to about $1,000. And on the right-hand side, this shows you how much you need to make to avoid rent burden. So in other words, people had to make about $40,000 to afford rent in Washington State in general. In 2013, though, for King County, this blue line, we see a massive increase in the median rent right at this point. This is about, 4 or 5 years after the recession recovery. A lot of properties got bought up by major corporate ownership, and a lot of new buildings came online that were stalled during the Great Recession. And what this did is immediately kind of started to increase the cost of living inside the King County and Seattle area. So at this point, it went from about $1,400 to close to $2,200 on average rent. This means that you need to make about $90,000 to live in King and the Snohomish area. So in Seattle, it's probably much higher. But what's concerning about this is this massive increase that could potentially continue to push more displacement and also impact evictions in a bigger way. We also want to compare who is making which amounts of money. So usually what we do is we talk about this concept of average or overall median household income. If you look at just median household income, this green bar across Washington State, you can see that whites and Asian households are making much more on the median, but we find that Latinx and Black households are falling below what's called 80% area median income. In other words, this is anyone falling below this line starts to qualify for housing subsidies, and continuously Black households across the whole state and Latinx households have been falling below this line. Even in King County, they're following at 50% AMI, which is considered very low income, and probably leading to a lot of the issues of rent burden and poverty that occur within those households, leading ultimately to the high rate of eviction in these areas. I'm going to skip over this part real quick, and I will just show that the overall rent burden for households in Washington State is close to 50%. This blue section kind of shows that the proportion of people that are paying 30 to 50% of their income to rent, and about 25% or so, or half of all people rent burden, are paying over 50%. What's problematic about this is that the population at risk of eviction falls within this red area. Just to kind of show that what is the impact of this research beyond scholarly interest, we were able to use this during the legislative session in 2019 to help change the 14-day pay or vacate period. But it's not just a scholarly endeavor. It's requires a coalition with attorneys, legislatures, and advocates to make this kind of change. But what was encouraging about it was how open and how successful this effort was, because the research kind of helped provide a backbone to try and make this kind of change. So I'm sure everyone is very interested in the local context. Obviously, I had mentioned about Baltimore City, that over 140,000 filings were occurring every year and a minimum 6,000 removals. We looked at sheriff data, which are the writs of restitution. And this map kind of shows the relative risk of eviction. You can visit this map at our website, evictions.study, and look more closely at some of the demographics and dynamics that are happening in that area. We saw that the eviction rate amongst African Americans was 6%, and what trends we saw was that there was a lot of churning or a lot of eviction that occurred in West Baltimore. These are highly segregated areas. These areas don't change that much, and so there's just kind of a continual kind of churn of evictions that happen. There's good research by Eva Rosen and some of her colleagues that talk about the punitive or paternal nature of evictions, of that landlords use an eviction notice to try and inspire or encourage their tenants to, or force them to pay the rent. So the number of evictions is just more of a formality that it happens. And I don't know if Matt Hill was able to make it on the call, or anyone from the Justice Center, but they can speak to this issue a lot better than I can in terms of the punitive nature of what's going on within evictions in Baltimore City. On the east side, we see that there's a lot of, there's some spikes of eviction happening in these areas. And obviously in some of the more predominantly white neighborhoods, especially in the north and in the south, there's an incredibly low rate of eviction that's happening. This is very similar to what happened in Washington State, where there's some sort of protective nature of white neighborhoods not seeing a lot of evictions. We also, at the Urban Displacement Project, we've recently been developing a displacement typology, which basically highlights where gentrification is happening. So to some degree, we can kind of look and see where evictions are happening most in terms of gentrification. And at the UDP, we break this up into kind of three categories. We have these low incomes or susceptible displacement or displacement categories in these kind of blue bars. In the purple, we have at risk to advanced gentrification. And then in the yellow to orange, we have this idea of stable or advanced exclusivity. In other words, these are areas that people have difficulty moving into. So these are, the blue are areas where places that people are not necessarily able to, they're at the highest risk of eviction, actually. It tends to happen most in these low-income, susceptible displacement spots, ongoing displacement, and at risk of gentrification, which kind of makes sense. But at UDP, we believe that there are, other than gentrification, there are other characteristics that are happening beyond just gentrification and exclusivity. We do not see a lot of evictions happening in these areas following down in this order from early on going down to exclusivity. So what this tells us basically is that you're not going to see a lot of eviction in gentrification. We also believe that displacement precedes gentrification. And those are the spaces, particularly low income and areas of ongoing displacement, where you do see a lot of eviction happening. So this kind of goes back to my early slide talking about this kind of separation between eviction and displacement that tends to occur. Now, moving quickly, I want to make sure I save time for questions. I'll end with a little bit of analysis that we have done in the Bay Area. This was in a NPR piece that we did for a local area that collected about 500 pandemic evictions, sheriff writs of restitution. Excuse me. And we see that what's interesting about in the pandemic, people are still filing and people are still getting evicted. But the lowest number of evictions are happening in spaces that have the highest protection. So San Francisco and the East Bay area, this is where Oakland and Berkeley, the University of Berkeley is right here. And these spaces only had 8 to 12 evictions, and which is, I would say, harkens to the local moratoriums and the high level of protections that the cities put in place for tenants. But in areas like San Jose or over in towards Sacramento and the area called Antioch towards Stockton, we see upwards of over 100 evictions occurring. These are areas that are also, again, where Black households have been displaced to from Oakland, from San Francisco, into these spaces where they do stay in the Bay Area. So that was a ton of information. In summary, populations at risk of eviction are low income, rent burden, women with children, but we see severe racial disparities as well as some neighborhood predictors. We see that segregation equals churning of evictions. Highly segregated and poor neighborhoods like West Baltimore see a high rate of that, or South Chicago. Pre-gentrifying areas see spikes in displacement, such as what was described in Chicago. Late gentrifying areas tend to see very low risk. So with that, I will leave it open to questions, which I'm sure there's some things that I missed here.
Thanks, Tim. We're going to go ahead. We have a couple of questions that have been posted, so we're going to go in order. So the first question is from Morgan Grove. Morgan, would you care to unmute and ask your question so everybody can hear it? I don't know if you're speaking, Morgan. We can't hear you. Grid so I can see where you are. All right, so we're not able to hear Morgan right now. Morgan, I'm going to go to the next question and then we'll come back to you. So Emma Gilligan is next.
Hi, Dr. Thomas. Thank you for the presentation. I was curious how you defined a head of household and then how you applied that definition to unique situations.
That's a great question and a very difficult one too. The census is very, let's say it hasn't updated its ideas of heads of household very well since the 50s. Largely, when you say head of household, if you're a male head of household, you can basically assume that it's a very traditional marriage where there's a man and wife in an area, and if your female headed household is there, it could be a same-sex partnership, or potentially it's a single mother. Realizing this limitation that the census has, we were able to look at that, and we needed that census data to kind of compare the number of renters by gender and by race, if possible. We looked at basically the first person named in the eviction filing. We looked at the first person named and used that as the head of household, and also to estimate the race and gender. So by and large, this is kind of a rough way to get at it. We did do some sampling strategies where we kind of randomly sampled on a lot of people, a lot of households, to kind of see how it kind of panned out. And at the end of the day, it really just came down to using the first person listed was the most effective way to define the head of household. And then we compared that to the rates within the census, knowing the limitations that the census has to try and identify like racial disparity and gender disparity.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So Morgan's sound is not working, so he asked me to read this out loud for him. For Baltimore, is the lower rate of eviction in areas that are predominantly white and affluent associated with a lower rate of rental units, or are you accounting for where rental units are or are not?
We are accounting for rental units. Some of the areas that are very high rate of white and renters tend to be more expensive rental units. And so those seem to be kind of protective measures. The higher rate of eviction, of the higher median rent of some of those areas protects against evictions, because in some way low-income households aren't able to afford those spaces. So they kind of avoid evictions in those areas. It's usually working class and low-wage workers that struggle the most with eviction. There's a lot of punitive landlords in those spaces too. So having that combination leads to a lot of evictions in those low-income areas.
Okay, next is, thank you. Next is Dawn Beeler. Dawn?
Hi, thank you so much for this really interesting talk. I had a question after hearing about both the kind of policy, the the policy changes that were adopted in response to your work in Washington State, and also the fact that it seems like it's pretty predictable where evictions are going to happen. And that led me to wonder whether there's a possibility of using this research and kind of that predictable pattern to help advocate for more targeted preservation of affordable rents in particular neighborhoods through different kinds of planning and housing tools, or development of more affordable housing in particular locations. I know that like affordable housing development is like way below the level where it ought to be, but I'm just wondering, like I feel like this could be a thing that we could be pushing more in the direction of, is preventing people from getting to that eviction notice by making sure that rents are staying affordable and that there's sufficient supply for everyone who needs it.
Absolutely. I believe in Maryland, I know the folks at the Public Justice Center have helped advocate for legal representation for folks facing eviction. Some of the biggest like policies that people have been pushing is just cause, which is basically having a good reason to evict someone. This kind of provides a speed bump in evicting landlords. Then there's also legal representation, which helps people navigate to determine whether or not landlords are, there's some nefarious activity going on. It helps resolve resolutions. And also just paying arrears is one of the biggest one too, just paying back rent. I think that this work is really important. I've actually just was invited. I was invited 2 weeks ago and spoke 2 Fridays ago at the White House on this issue because we can predict where evictions are happening. We do know that there are particular neighborhood characteristics, so we can use public data to try and determine what's going on, where it's happening. Again, we're missing data a lot, and once we get that data, that's how we can help produce what I call things that people can't unsee when it comes to evictions. And I think you're right. Eviction is resolving evictions is kind of the band-aid to the real problem. The real problem is low wages, high income gaps, dealing with the legacies of segregation and racial inequality. The city of Baltimore is a perfect example of what neighborhood formations have impacted populations for a long time. So I hope that this work can help as much as possible in pushing, positive policies towards that. Does that answer your question enough? Cool.
So we do have another question. I'm going to invite the person asking the question to unmute in a moment. I do just want to mention we do have one housing attorney from the Public Justice Center who's on the call right now, Juan Carlos Silane. So maybe after this next question, if he wants to offer anything in terms of this part of the conversation, you could do that. But right now we're going to go to Terrell Askew, who has the next question. Could you unmute and go ahead and ask your question?
Thank you. I kind of put it in the chat, but I said in your presentation, you appear to assert a correlation or relationship between race and gender in evictions. Since a lot of areas where evictions occur in Baltimore City are also heavily policed, is there also a correlation between crime and evictions? And the reason I ask that is because the weakness of the laws in both the city and the state around evictions and these being heavily policed areas suggest that this could be a crime strategy. And another way of basically removing people that you don't want from neighborhoods so that you can move in populations that you do.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, I have not done, I want to. There's a paper I want to do on crime and eviction, the relationship. There is research that talks about how policing, for example, domestic violence is a classic example of if there's a high rate of domestic violence, it kind of just causes a nuisance and the landlord is more likely to evict, right? There is a rational choice that goes on in some of the research in low-income neighborhoods that if the landlord doesn't have a tenant to replace a low-income tenant who's paying, falling back on rent, they will likely prevent from evicting that tenant because they want to get their money, right? That's kind of an assumption that's made. Now, from there, if there's a nuisance, say for example, the police are called, or there are other infractions that happen, that can increase the likelihood of eviction. But to your point, I think that any increased level of contact with police would only exacerbate that circumstance. So I think that there is a relationship with that, because it seems that where these evictions are happening are over policed areas, particularly with like the whole reason why Black Lives Matter movement has come up to speed. It's basically repeating the tenets of what was going on during the civil rights movement of high rents, over policing, all these other kind of issues. So to some degree, it's like this whole eviction conversation is almost, it's very deja vu of what's been going on for the past, almost 100 years. And, but I do believe that there is definitely a high relationship of that. It, can impact how landlords see their own tenants and further increase the racial disparity, like the things that happen within the Black population, in particular around eviction. So I think, yeah, there's definitely got to be a relationship with that. There is some research that backs it up.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I don't know, I don't want to put you on the spot, but Juan Carlos, I will ask you if there's anything you want to offer. The Public Justice Center does a lot of really important work in this area. I don't know how many people on the call are familiar with their work, but if you want to sort of respond to a couple of the points that were made earlier, please feel free to unmute yourself and do so.
Well, thank you very much, and nice to meet you all. Thank you, Dr. Thomas and Mr. Andy. I can't see your last name. My name is okay. My name is Juan Carlos Sila, and I'm an attorney with Public Justice Center. I'm in the housing project, and I think that earlier when Dr. Thomas mentioned the PJC, it was when they were talking about landlords taking actions. Maybe I'm not correct. Maybe I don't remember correctly, but landlords right now, because of COVID, they couldn't bring actions for failure to pay rent, for instance, and they were starting to bring more actions such as tenant holding over or breach of lease actions as subterfuge to collect rent. And sometimes we saw that when we got to court and there was legal representation, landlords backed off and they were like, well, I just want to collect the money. So that's something that's been happening. Also, I think that going into poverty and the relationship with race, I think that landlords count that people that don't have necessarily access to legal counsel won't give a fight in court. So a lot of the judgments in the rent court are default judgments, and people get evicted and they don't know why they got evicted or what happened in the case. So the project that PJC worked with and got approved for Baltimore City, it's the Universal Representation Project, the Right to Counsel project. So that's going to be implemented in the next few months, and hopefully everyone will have access to counsel probably by next year, hopefully. Yeah. Thank you. I don't know if there are any questions I can help with.
Yeah, I would just say without the Public Justice Center, the work in Baltimore we did would not be possible. I mean, it was, I happened to meet Matt Hill at a conference where I was giving a talk, and he's like, hey, we have 140,000 evictions. Are you interested in looking at this? I'm like, yes. And the sheriff department actually came to them and said, hey, we have a huge issue. Can we, do that? And this led to exactly what Juan was talking about with the new legislation. It's this, public scholarship helping push local issues to the forefront on this. And so I'm really grateful, Juan, for what you're doing and everything that you all are doing there.
I'll just add, for those who are interested in these issues in Baltimore, there's actually a package of bills in the legislature under discussion having to do with renters' rights. One of the things that gets talked about a lot, which is kind of surprising, is that Baltimore has one of the lowest fees for filing eviction notices in the country. And there's a move to actually increase those fees, which could probably reduce, it costs landlords practically nothing. And so they just do it for any reason at all. And there's some thought that that would actually reduce the number of those as well. But for people who are interested, there's a lot going on. And I'm sure if you just go to the Public Justice Center website, you can see a lot of information about that. It looks like there's a couple of questions here. All right, there was an exchange. Let's see. Oh, Tim was responding to Sarah Fout. Dylan.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. That was a great presentation. I really enjoyed all the pretty graphics as well. I had a quick question about kind of the different regions that you studied. You know, the West Coast cities in Chicago are all experiencing growth. Baltimore is not growing. And so I wondered if there are some kind of takeaways that you might have about Baltimore or how that might affect the patterns that you see for Baltimore City.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing, it's interesting. Baltimore is not growing, yet evictions are almost the worst in terms of like count, just sheer counts. And I think what that does is reinforces the fact that that eviction is an additional it's an additional cost to being poor, right? And even in areas where there is a lot of change, such as Washington, the Bay Area, the West Coast, you know, even Chicago, it still happens in the least mobile spaces there too. This is basically where it's concerning to me because it feels like we're hurting a lot of folks, especially folks that have faced like decades of marginalization. We're hurting them into these spaces where opportunities are just running dry. It's a hole in the bucket, basically. And you have poor education, low networks, you don't have great jobs. You just have the compounding issue of what evictions do, and just daily struggles on top of daily struggles. So there's a book in the 1990s written by Doug Massey and Nancy Denton called American Apartheid, and what that spoke about was segregation in the United States. I think that it's just a continuation of that context, that dynamic. That cities like Baltimore, unfortunately, with such low change, you know, it's showing what racial inequality is like on a grand scale, but how it occurs is very similar in other areas too. If that makes sense. So yeah, it's difficult. What's frustrating too about Maryland in general is that, you know, Maryland politics to some degree it kind of ignores Baltimore quite a bit, because it's like, oh, it's Baltimore, it's a Baltimore problem, it's blah 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 blah. It's basically saying it's a black problem, and they tend to avoid what goes on here, and they require you to analyze what's going on in the rest of the area, you know, St. George up you know, north, and other areas too, to see what's going on, to even consider changing policy for the whole state. If it wasn't for the pandemic, I don't think that Maryland would be considering these legislation, you know, these litigations or anything like that, because you're starting to see that eviction is spreading beyond just groups that have been marginalized, such as in Baltimore. So, but Baltimore is also a resilient city. I've never seen a group more just passionate about saving and wanting to help, which I think is the benefit. In areas like King County, you have this disillusion of political beliefs, and it's hard to get things passed there to really help racially marginalized populations. But in Baltimore, there's just a big push for that, and there will continue to be a big push. I think, for example, Oakland has been talking about, you know, it's a pretty large Black population for the Bay Area, they have some of the best protections and some of the best community and best culture and things like that. And it's like, how can we thrive and continue to boost that type of effort and passion? Yeah, I think it's very important. So while it's difficult, I think there's a lot of hope also for Baltimore. But yeah, it's kind of my thoughts on that.
Thank you. We are at lecture 101. So I want to first thank Dr. Thomas, but before closing, two things. Number one, Dr. Thomas graciously agreed if there are people who want to stick around and talk for a few minutes afterward, we can do that. If you're interested in doing that, just stay on the call. The other thing is there was a message posted by Gabriella Dixon-Larata on behalf of Baltimore Renters United, which is another very important group doing really important work on this issue. So it's in the chat, but I'll just ask Gabriella, do you want to say something about that just to call people's attention to what you wrote in the chat?
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm a paralegal at PJC, so I just wanted to promote this. The housing justice package is something that PJC has promoted with other housing advocates in the area. And right now there's actually a housing justice package that's been promoted by the leadership, but the one that we want to focus on that we feel is more expansive and will genuinely protect renters is the one that RUM has put before the legislature. So if you're interested in learning more about the kinds of reforms that we are hoping to pass to make life easier for tenants, I would just take a look at the website and keep an eye on our social media, because we are posting sort of personal testimonials and the stories of tenants to get people to understand that this isn't just like it's a systemic problem, and it's very much an individual problem that affects people's livelihoods. So yeah, I would definitely check that out if you want to learn more.
Thanks very much. Okay, so I'm going to stop the recording now, and this will be what gets posted after we get it back.